Okay. In the last video, I said this is going to be a four-part series. It's actually going to be a five-part series. I thought about it for a moment, and I think that we need a little bit more backstory so you understand a couple things before we move forward. This will help you find your space within which one of these areas you're struggling. If you are struggling and you know that something has to change and you feel the dam about to break, is it spiritual? Is it emotional or is it psychological? Again, emotional and psychological overlap, emotional and spiritual overlap. There's some overlap there, but we can pin these things down. And when you do, you know exactly where to start the work. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to dive into that a little bit. Does that work for you? Good. Okay. Here we go. Carl Jung said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. I mentioned that. And Brianna Wiest said discomfort is what happens when you're on the precipice of change. Understanding where you're at and which category you're in here will be helpful for that because you'll know exactly where to start. I'm going to start with emotional triggers, and I've got some notes because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So excuse me if I'm a little distracted with this. The spiritual triggers, the way to recognize these is the spiritual triggers involve things like faith, um, what's life about, meaning of life, and then meaning and purpose, like big esoteric questions, right? And when I talk about crisis of faith, I need to differentiate for you that, this can be losing your religion kind of crisis of faith, like traditional crisis of faith, like a priest suddenly goes, "What have I done with my life?" But it doesn't have to be. It can be something as simple as you took over your father's business because that was what was expected of you, and once you became part of the business, you realize that's not what you're supposed to be. That's also a crisis of faith because you've dove into this thing. It has become part of who you are, and now you're going, "Is this who I am?" See what I'm saying? That's a crisis of faith. So this is some signs that you may be in a spiritual crisis of some sort, rather than say an emotional or psychological. Though there may be emotional and psychological parts associated with that as well. Sometimes with this, I should say also that there are no obvious triggers. Like there's nothing in particular that is you can pick this out. It's just a general sense in here that I'm not happy. Like there's nothing that's particularly triggering it. It's just waking up every day and going, "Oh, I got to drag myself out of bed." It can be that simple, right? Where you just know something's got to change. Okay, that's spiritual. So now let's look at the details for emotional. Okay, emotional pain, the triggers for this are usually things like grief, shame, fear. It can come from losing someone or feeling rejected. Um, it can basically give you a heavy sense of self. Like it's a very deep weight inside of you. When you have emotional pain going on. Um, this can also be triggered by things like, realizing you've made a mistake and admitting you're wrong. You ever done that? I know you probably have, where you've just done the wrong thing and you just admit it. Not long ago, I was on a walk with some friends and we were talking about, I forget what it was. It may have been politics or something. It was whatever it was. It was a difference of nuanced opinion. And I remember I got annoyed, and I could tell I was annoyed, but I couldn't tell if they could tell I was annoyed. But I felt like I came across as a little bit rougher edge than normal. And a few minutes later, I just apologized for it. I said, "Look, I don't know how I came across there, but I felt a change in me, and I just want to acknowledge it." And and they said, "Yeah, I noticed it was subtle, but and it felt very vulnerable to do that, but it was the right thing for me to do." And they actually both thanked me. They said, "Oh, that was really cool," and they actually complimented me, which is it's always nice. Um, so even though it feels vulnerable to admit when we blew it, when we know you blew it, and you're like, "I'm not going to say anything. Maybe they won't notice that I blew it," right? When you do admit it, it looks like strength. It doesn't look like weakness to the person receiving it, unless they're like a narcissist or something. But most people will see that as being a sign of really strong character and personal strength. So, but that's one of those things that can, if you're feeling that, if you've admitted to doing something wrong and you feel heavy about it, you're probably dealing with an emotional trigger of some sort. Now let's talk about psychological triggers, things to recognize if you're in the psychological side of this thing. If you're going through change, like external change, like when you think psychological, so emotional is more internal, spiritual is more internal, mostly. Psychological, oftentimes, we can see it out here, right? So if you've changed jobs, if you've changed relationships, if you had a death in the family, these things can bring anxiety, deep anxiety. Sometimes it's not something that's even that obvious, but it's things that you can usually identify outside of yourself. Now, psychologically, those are really good triggers. They're not always there because sometimes we have stuff that's buried really, really deep, right? Stuff that goes with, like I said, can go way back before even our memory that set us up for being the way we are today. We're not going to get into all that because that's some deep work you can do on your own with your psychologist, your therapist, or your coach, or whoever. But I'm just talking about recognizing the symptoms so we know where our jumping off point is. So, in looking at spiritual, in looking at emotional, looking at psychological, can you start to get a sense of where you're at on here? Like, is this thing that's plaguing you, is it spiritual? Is it emotional, or maybe is it psychological? If you're still not sure, that's okay. It's not a big deal. We're going to get into the 3 next videos. And when we do, we're going to dive into that even more, and it'll be fine. It's okay to be uncertain here. Uncertainty it's powerful. Facing failure or the unknown is really uncomfortable. When we're making change, and this is part of making changes, when we lean into these things and we do the work around them, we're changing ourselves. We're changing ourselves, and we're very resistant to that. Change is safety, and we've been hardwired for that since, long before the cavemen, because safety meant staying alive, right? But we don't live in a world where that's much of a threat anymore. But we don't like change because of that. It's very deep. But it can be very triggering being, feeling uncertainty. Like, I'm about to change. What's that going to do to my life? Don't do that to yourself. Be here. Be right here in this moment and do the work, and you'll get through this. It's a little uncomfortable, but discomfort is what happens when you're on the precipice of change. You're on the precipice of change. Trust yourself. You got this. In the next 3 videos, we're going to cover these 3 topics more in depth and show you how to work through each one of them individually once you figure out where you're at, which one of those emotional triggers is the one that's getting you. Each one's going to be a short, pretty packed video that I should be able to get you from point A to point B, and will actually help you start doing the work, okay, including some tools that will help you get there. So thanks for being here. If you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, subscribe so you make sure you get the updates. And if you haven't read this book yet, 101 Essays by Brianna Wiest, I think I'm pronouncing your name right, Brianna. Read this. It's fantastic. It's one of those you can just crack open and you find a page and there's like something awesome on it. It's always a great piece of advice in here. Wonderful book, but it talks a lot about what we're talking about here in at least a few of the essays. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next video.